The delta between America's tech scene and every other's is huge. Why is that? Well, we organize around ideas. We believe in fairness and meritocracy. We're willing to suppress our ego in the service of a larger concept. We're not overly political, actually, in building things. And we get to keep the fruits of our labor in a way that in many other countries you couldn't. And this is totally unique. But because it's unique, we may not defend it as much as we should because we just assume it's normal. It is not in any way normal.
I want to start this episode by explaining the idea of soft belief. It's a central theme in Nicholas Zamiska Alex Karp's book, The Technological Republic: Hard Power, Soft Belief, and the Future of the West, and arguably the crux of the entire argument. When Zamiska and Karp talk about soft belief, he is not offering a slogan or a motivational phrase. He is trying to name a failure he sees in modern institutions, especially technological ones, and to articulate a way of thinking that allows people to act without pretending they possess certainty. At first, the phrase sounds contradictory. Belief is usually associated with firmness and conviction. Soft suggests hesitation or weakness. But Zamiska and Karp's argument is that the real danger today is not soft belief. It is hard belief masquerading as neutrality, or worse, the refusal to believe in anything at all. Soft belief is meant to occupy a third space. Zamiska and Karp operate in environments where uncertainty is unavoidable. Intelligence work, national security, and large institutions under adversarial pressure. In these settings, decisions must be made with incomplete information, and waiting for certainty can be catastrophic. In that world, the idea that the data will decide collapses very quickly. Data does not tell you what to value. It does not tell you which outcomes are acceptable or which risks are worth taking. Those choices require prior commitments. The only real question is whether you acknowledge those commitments openly or smuggle them in under the language of objectivity. Zamiska and Karp argue that much of modern technocratic culture does the latter. It claims neutrality while quietly encoding preferences, efficiency over legitimacy, scale over accountability, optimization over meaning. This is not the absence of belief. It is belief without self-awareness. Soft belief begins by rejecting that posture. At its core, soft belief means holding convictions strongly enough to act on them, but lightly enough to revise them. You act as if certain things are true, not because they can be proven beyond doubt, but because refusing to act is itself a decision, and often a worse one. Liberal democracy is a useful example. It cannot be defended through pure empiricism. There is no controlled experiment proving it is objectively optimal across all contexts and futures. And yet societies either commit to defending it or they don't. Waiting for perfect proof is indistinguishable from abdication. Zamiska and Karp's concern is that Western elites have grown uncomfortable with this kind of commitment. Afraid of being wrong, they retreat into process, metrics, and procedural neutrality. Systems are optimized while the deeper question, what those systems are for, is quietly avoided. Soft belief insists that this avoidance is not wisdom. It is fragility. At the same time, soft belief is not ideological rigidity. Hard belief refuses to update. It treats contradiction as betrayal and dissent as threat. History shows how often that posture collapses under pressure from reality. Soft belief is designed for reality pushing back. It treats beliefs as working hypotheses with moral weight. You commit to them, but you also build systems that test them. You expect disagreement. You design for friction. A belief that cannot survive challenge is not strong, it is brittle. There is also a moral claim embedded here. Karp rejects the idea that technology can be value neutral. Every system encodes assumptions about what matters. Algorithms shape behavior. Platforms shape discourse. Tools deployed at scale shape political and social outcomes. Soft belief says that if you exercise that kind of power, you are obligated to articulate what you believe and why, even if those beliefs are provisional. This allows moral orientation without moralism. You can say, these values matter and we are willing to defend them, without claiming infallibility or universal certainty. Moralism demands obedience. Soft belief demands engagement. Ultimately, soft belief is a posture toward power and uncertainty. It says, we do not have final answers, but we do have responsibilities. We will act knowing we might be wrong. We will revise knowing revision has costs. and we will not pretend that refusing to choose absolves us of accountability. In a world oscillating between absolutism and cynicism, Zamiska and Karp's idea of soft belief is an attempt to keep institutions acting. Eyes open, assumptions exposed, and systems built to learn rather than collapse. Today we're discussing the Technological Republic, Hard Power, Soft Belief, and the Future of the West, written by Alex Karp and Nicholas W. Zamiska. The book is authored by Palantir's co-founder and chief executive, alongside the company's longtime internal counsel. At first glance, it looks like a book about technology, or Silicon Valley, or artificial intelligence, and it's not. It's a book about power, and about what happens when the people most capable of wielding it decide they don't want the responsibility that comes with it. Early in the book, the authors make their position clear. As they write, "The market is a powerful engine of destruction, creative and otherwise, but it often fails to deliver what is most needed at the right time." That sentence frames everything that follows. What Karp and Zamiska are pointing to is not a failure of innovation, but a failure of direction. Over the past few decades, the technology industry that came to dominate the American economy increasingly behaved as if it existed outside the nation that made it possible, as if the United States were not a political project to be renewed, but a dying empire to be routed around. The authors argue that many founders came to see the country this way, and they describe the consequences directly. They write that many in Silicon Valley viewed the United States as a dying empire whose slow descent could not be allowed to stand in the way of their own rise and the new era's gold rush. So they built platforms, that they built engagement engines, they built systems to optimize preferences, attention, and consumption. But the book's argument is that what they largely abandoned was any serious attempt to advance society itself, to ensure that human civilization continued moving forward rather than drifting. The authors describe the belief system that replaced that ambition, and they are blunt about its limits. As they put it, the prevailing ethical framework of the Valley has devolved into a narrow and thin utilitarian approach, one that casts individuals as mere atoms in a system to be managed and contained. What was set aside were the hardest questions, questions that cannot be optimized away. What constitutes a good life? Which collective endeavors are worth pursuing together? What does a shared national identity make possible? In the book's words, these questions were dismissed as the anachronisms of another age. But history didn't cooperate, and this is where the authors introduce one of the central concepts of the book: soft belief. They don't define it with a slogan. Instead, they show what happens when it disappears. Soft belief is the shared moral confidence that allows a society to act together without coercion, the background agreement about what is worth building, what is worth defending, and what obligations individuals owe something larger than themselves. When soft belief erodes, the authors argue, power doesn't vanish, it becomes unmoored, and they connect that erosion directly to technology. At one point, Karp and Zamiska explain what happens when belief gives way to neutrality. They write, "The vital yet messy questions of what constitutes a good life, which collective endeavors society should pursue, and what a shared and national identity can make possible have been set aside." For a time, this retreat felt safe, even virtuous. But the world didn't stay still. Artificial intelligence emerged not just as a consumer technology, but as a decisive factor in intelligence, logistics, targeting, and command. Great power competition returned. Wars once thought unthinkable reappeared, fast, brutal, and technologically dense. And this is where the book stops being abstract. The company Alexander Karp leads, Palantir, is not writing from a distance. Its software has been deployed by Western governments and allied militaries in real-world operations, supporting intelligence and battlefield coordination in Ukraine, counterterrorism and defense operations in the Middle East, and long-standing partnerships with the U.S. Department of Defense, U.S. intelligence agencies, and allied security services. And these are environments where failure costs lives, not market share, which is why the authors insist that neutrality is an illusion. As they write, the engineering elite of Silicon Valley has an affirmative obligation to participate in the defense of the nation and the articulation of a national project. And they argue that this obligation has become unavoidable because of AI. In the book's words, artificial intelligence. for the first time in history, presents a plausible challenge to our species for creative supremacy in the world. That reality, they argue, collapses the luxury of deferral. They write, "The moment to decide who we are and what we aspire to be as a society and a civilization is now." This book is ultimately a warning that hard power without soft belief collapses, that technology without moral direction corrodes, and that civilizations fall not when they lack talent, but when their most capable people decide that building only for themselves is enough. And the authors return near the beginning to the line that now reads less like a slogan and more like an indictment. As they put it, the grandiose rallying cry of a generation of founders in Silicon Valley was simply to build. Few asked what needed to be built and why. That is the question this episode is about. At this point in the book, Karp and Zamiska stop circling the problem and name it directly. They turn their attention to Silicon Valley itself, not as an abstraction, but as a culture. And they choose Google as their example not because it is uniquely corrupt or malicious, but because it is unusually successful, unusually influential, and unusually representative of how elite technology culture now thinks about responsibility. What they are trying to show is not hypocrisy, but moral asymmetry. They are interested in what kinds of power Silicon Valley is comfortable exercising, and which kinds it reflexively avoids. So they describe the resistance among Google employees to building software for the US military. And then they make a distinction that is easy to miss, but absolutely central to the book's argument. I'm going to quote them at length here because the precision matters. The authors write, "The employees at Google who resisted leveraging the machinery of their company in service of building software for the US military know what they oppose, but not what they are for. The problem that we are describing is not a principled commitment to pacifism or nonviolence. It is a more fundamental abandonment of belief in anything. The company, at its core, builds elaborate and extraordinarily lucrative mechanisms to monetize the placement of advertising for consumer goods and services that accompany search results. The service is vital and has remade the world, but the business and a significant subset of its employees stop short of engaging with more essential questions of national purpose and identity, with an affirmative vision of what we want to and should be building as part of a national project, not simply an articulation of the lines that one will not cross. They remain content to monetize our search histories even as they decline to defend our collective security." What the authors are doing here is not moral grandstanding. They are pointing out that avoidance has become a substitute for judgment. Building systems that influence billions of people's behavior is considered ethically neutral. Optimizing attention, shaping consumption, and monetizing data are treated as technical problems. But building tools for national defense, even in a democratic system under civilian control, is treated as inherently suspect. This is the inversion they are trying to expose. The question they are implicitly asking is not, should Google build weapons? It is, why does one form of power feel morally safe while another feels untouchable? And the answer, they argue, is not pacifism, it is the absence of belief. The authors then widen the lens because this posture didn't appear out of nowhere. They remind the reader that Silicon Valley's rise was not the result of spontaneous market magic, but of a dense ecosystem of public investment, state capacity, and institutional support. They write, "Google, of course, along with any number of Silicon Valley's largest technology enterprises, owes its existence in significant part to the educational culture, as well as the legal protections and capital markets of the United States. The personal computer itself, as well as the internet, was the result of military funding and support in the 1960s from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, a division of the U.S. Department of Defense." This is not a controversial claim among historians, but it is an uncomfortable one in modern tech culture because it undermines the story Silicon Valley likes to tell about itself. A story of lone founders, garage startups, and heroic individualism. To drive the point home, the authors cite the economist Mariana Mazzucato. They write, in her book, The Entrepreneurial State, Mariana Mazzucato calls out this collective amnesia in the Valley, noting that the U.S. military's role has been forgotten by this era's software titans, who have rewritten history in order to place themselves at its center and exclude and diminish the role of government in fostering and sustaining innovation. What's being described here is not ingratitude. it's historical editing, a narrowing of the story that makes it easier to reject obligation because the obligation itself has been erased from memory, and then the authors make a move that is easy to overlook but deeply important. They argue that when belief collapses at the top, when institutions stop articulating what they are for, talent doesn't rebel, it drifts. They write, and in the absence of any larger project for which to fight, many simply turned elsewhere, not out of some moral failing, but because of the transformation of our most hallowed educational institutions into administrative caretakers, not vessels of culture. This is where the argument stops being about Google or Palantir or even technology. It becomes an argument about talent allocation, and to make that concrete, the authors introduce a figure 5, that quietly says more than 1,000 opinion columns. The chart tracks the percentage of Harvard graduates entering finance or consulting from 1971 to 2022. In the early 1970s, only about 6% of Harvard graduates went into those fields. By the 1980s and 1990s, the number rises steadily. By 2007, just before the financial crisis, it peaks at 47%. Nearly half of one of the world's most selective graduating classes choosing 2 industries whose primary function is allocation, optimization, and risk management. The authors explain why this matters. They write, "Our reluctance to take on the larger questions has left an enormous amount of talent and zeal on the sidelines. Entire swaths of our generation's greatest minds have drifted, some more willingly than others, into a narrow subset of industries." They then cite more recent data. Quoting again, "A survey conducted in 2023 of graduating seniors at Harvard University found that nearly half of the entire class was headed for jobs in finance and consulting. This is not framed as a moral indictment of those graduates. It is framed as a signal failure. When a society cannot articulate what it is building toward, talent flows to the places with the clearest incentives, the least ambiguity, and the lowest existential risk." And the authors argue that higher education has accelerated this process. They write, "The instrumentalization of American higher education continues unchecked. They give 2 trends side by side. On one hand, the decline of the humanities. The number of graduating college seniors who earned a degree in the humanities fell from 14% in 1966 to 7% in 2010. On the other, the explosive growth of technical majors, enrollment in computer science and engineering majors, more than doubled between 2014 and 2023. The point here is not anti-technology, it's anti-fragmentation. The authors are arguing that we trained a generation to be technically brilliant while discouraging them from asking the very questions that make technical power intelligible. They close this section with a line that explains why belief is not optional, even for engineers. They write, "We need engineers who are engaged with and curious about the world, the movement of history and its contradictions, not merely skilled at programming." That sentence captures the deeper warning. A society that produces engineers without belief will still build extraordinary systems, but it will no longer know why it is building them, or who they are ultimately for. After establishing how belief eroded and how talent drifted as a result, Karp and Zamiska turn to a more operational question. If modern institutions struggle to articulate purpose, how do groups actually make decisions when outcomes matter, information is incomplete, and conditions change quickly? The authors approach this question by examining decision-making systems that function under real constraints rather than idealized assumptions. They are interested in how groups arrive at accurate outcomes without relying on hierarchy, formal authority, or centralized control. To do this, they turn to empirical research rather than theory. Specifically, they draw on the work of the biologist Martin Lindauer, whose observations of honeybee swarms in the early 1950s became foundational for understanding collective decision-making. Lindauer was studying what happens when a swarm of bees must select a new nesting site. This is not a symbolic exercise. The decision determines whether the colony survives. What Lindauer observed challenged prevailing assumptions about intelligence and coordination. As the authors describe it, the bees, for Lindauer, represented something different in nature. The swarm that he was observing was not merely a collection of discrete individual animals. The precision and extent of their coordination and lack of any apparent means of centralized management made clear that the bees formed a discrete system, a coherent whole, whose capacity for assessing and adapting to its surroundings would prompt a reassessment of what constitutes an organism in the decades to come. The key point is structural. Decision-making capacity does not reside in a leader or a controlling unit. It emerges from interactions among participants who are independently evaluating options and sharing information. Lindauer documented a process in which multiple potential nesting sites were identified by scout bees. Each scout independently assessed a site and then returned to the swarm to communicate its assessment through a waggle dance. The intensity and duration of the dance corresponded to the perceived quality of the site. At this stage, there was no agreement and no attempt to force convergence. As the authors note, even when some sites had attracted more attention than others, naturally there was not yet any talk of an agreement. This lack of early convergence is central to the system's effectiveness. The swarm maintains multiple competing hypotheses simultaneously. Poor options are not eliminated through authority or consensus. They lose support through lack of verification. When conditions change, the system responds immediately. The authors describe this adjustment directly. The swarm adjusted accordingly and quickly. A new batch of potential sites were located by the scouts, some of which were only announced by a single dance and received no attention from the population at large, while others were lavished with more attention. The system does not attempt to preserve prior commitments. Information that becomes obsolete is discarded without procedural delay. Over time, one option accumulates sustained support. As Lindauer observed, and as the authors recount, a particular spot 300 meters away eventually emerged as the favorite. The remaining holdouts had relented and given in. This convergence does not occur through coercion or compromise. It occurs because the evidentiary balance shifts. Once convergence is reached, the group acts decisively. As the authors write, the following morning at 9:40 a.m., Lindauer observed that the entire swarm of bees, having negotiated over the options and settled on a preferred location, took off and moved into its new home. The sequence matters. Extended disagreement is tolerated while information is incomplete. Once evidence accumulates, coordination becomes immediate and total. Lindauer's work was later cited by researchers studying collective decision-making across species. The consistent finding was that effective coordination can arise without central control, provided certain conditions are met. Karp and Zamiska draw out those conditions explicitly. Information must originate at the periphery, from individuals closest to changing conditions. Proposals must compete openly. Authority must remain flexible until reality resolves uncertainty. They summarize this organizational property directly. They write, "The swarm organizes itself around the problem at hand." This is not a metaphorical claim. It describes a specific alignment between information, authority, and action. The authors then contrast this structure with how many modern institutions operate. In hierarchical organizations, information is often delayed or filtered as it moves upward. Decision authority is fixed in advance rather than responsive to evidence. Disagreement is discouraged because it is perceived as destabilizing. As a result, organizations converge early, often before sufficient information is available. Once decisions are made, they become difficult to revise, even when conditions change. The authors argue that this design performs poorly in environments characterized by uncertainty, rapid change, and high consequence. They extend this critique to engineering organizations, startups, and public institutions alike. In each case, performance depends less on individual competence than on whether the organization allows parallel exploration, sustained disagreement, and late-stage convergence driven by evidence. This has direct implications for societies operating in the software era. Technological systems accelerate feedback loops. Decisions propagate faster, errors scale quickly. In such conditions, institutional designs that suppress dissent or centralize authority away from information systematically produce worse outcomes. The author's conclusion in this section is not moral or ideological, it is practical. Groups make better decisions when they are structured to surface competing interpretations, allow those interpretations to be tested against reality, and delay convergence until evidence forces it. This model of decision-making is not optional in high-stakes technological environments. It is a requirement, and it leads directly to the next issue the book addresses. If advanced societies must rely on institutions capable of this kind of decision-making, And if technological power is increasingly tied to national security, what happens when those institutions are asked to exercise hard power at scale? People hear Palantir, and they usually don't know what bucket to put it in. It trades like a technology company, it speaks the language of defense, and it operates with an intensity more typical of consulting firms that embed deeply with their clients. The confusion is not accidental. For years, Palantir has resisted simple categorization. Let's strip that away. At its core, Palantir builds software that helps organizations integrate data from many systems, make that data usable, and then use it to run operations. It is not a consumer product. It is not a visualization tool or a marginal productivity upgrade. It is an operating layer designed for environments where information is fragmented, permissions are complex, systems do not talk to one another, and decisions carry real consequences. The easiest way to understand Palantir is to stop thinking about data as something you store and start thinking about it as something you use to decide. Palantir sells decision infrastructure. Some of its deployments sit inside military workflows, where software reduces the time between sensing something in the environment and acting on it. In defense terms, that means compressing the distance between information and action. When that distance shrinks, outcomes change. That is why governments pay for the software and why Palantir continues to win defense work. But that is only one slice of the company. More broadly, Palantir helps institutions take scattered information and turn it into coordinated action. Sometimes that action involves military targeting. Sometimes it involves moving supplies. Sometimes it involves running a hospital system, managing a supply chain, or preventing fraud. The underlying problem is always the same: fragmented systems, partial information, high stakes, and a need to coordinate people under pressure. Palantir's origins help explain why it operates this way. The company was founded in the early 2000s, in the middle of the War on Terror. At that time, the US military and intelligence agencies were not suffering from a lack of data. They were overwhelmed by it. In Iraq and Afghanistan, insurgency and roadside bombs were killing US and allied soldiers, while information about networks, routes, and behaviors sat in disconnected databases. The problem was not collection, it was integration. Palantir's original pitch was straightforward. Take what is already being collected, integrate it, and make it possible to identify patterns quickly enough to matter. Networks instead of isolated events. Relationships instead of raw reports. That combination, integration, analysis, and operational use, remains the company's core. Over time, Palantir expanded that approach well beyond its original use cases. Today, the company positions itself as a problem solver for large institutions, particularly in government and defense. That is not just branding, it reflects how the company works. Traditional enterprise software is sold, installed, and then largely left alone unless there is a renewal or a failure. Palantir operates differently. It embeds deeply with its customers. Its engineers work alongside users, learn existing workflows, and adapt the software to real operational needs. In environments filled with legacy systems, political constraints, and fragmented authority, this model matters. You cannot simply drop in a generic tool and expect results. From the outside, this looks like services. From the inside, it is how the software becomes part of the institution's decision cycle. The product exists, but the product only matters if it is used where decisions are actually made. At a high level, Palantir operates two parallel platforms. One is designed for government, defense, and intelligence environments, where permissions, auditability, and compartmentalization are essential. The other is designed for commercial organizations that face similar data integration problems expressed in a different language: supply chains, manufacturing, finance, operations, compliance. Underneath, both platforms do the same three things: ingest data from many sources, model relationships and processes, and present outputs that people can act on. More recently, Palantir has leaned heavily into artificial intelligence. The marketing language can sound inflated, but the practical claim is narrower and more concrete. Once data is integrated, governed, and accessible, machine learning and language models can be layered on top to support faster analysis and automate parts of complex workflows. This is where Palantir's AI posture differs from many startups. Most AI demonstrations assume clean data and controlled environments. Palantir's claim is that it already lives inside the messy institutional reality where decisions actually happen. The value of AI in this context is not novelty, it is acceleration. It would be incomplete to talk about Palantir without acknowledging why it remains controversial. The first reason is obvious. Software built for defense and intelligence agencies can be used in lethal contexts. That is not an abstract ethical debate. It is the nature of the work. It is also why Palantir attracts scrutiny in a way most enterprise software companies do not. The second is law enforcement and immigration. Palantir's work with agencies like ICE and local police departments places it directly at the intersection of state power and civil liberties. Even when there is agreement that laws should be enforced, questions remain about how much data integration and analysis should be used, under what oversight, and with what transparency. These concerns are not peripheral. They are central to how the company is perceived. The third controversy is structural. When critical public functions rely on private platforms, questions of opacity arise. Who has access? What linkages exist? What data is retained? What can be exported? And by whom? Civil liberties groups and privacy advocates worry less about any single feature than about the accumulation of capability behind the scenes. Those concerns cannot be waved away. The most relevant tension, however, connects directly to the broader theme of this episode. Palantir presents itself as part of a newer wave of defense-adjacent companies challenging an older contracting model dominated by large primes. Historically, defense procurement focused on hardware, jets, ships, missiles, with software treated as a secondary concern. Palantir's argument is that software is now central to modern conflict and coordination, and that procurement and delivery models must change accordingly. Whether one agrees with that self-image or not, Palantir has clearly succeeded in embedding itself deeper into government workflows. Its work spans military data platforms, systems designed to shorten decision timelines, and deployments with allied governments. It also extends beyond defense into public health, logistics, and large-scale institutional modernization. The pattern is consistent: high-stakes institutions, messy data, and urgent coordination needs. The cleanest way to summarize Palantir without hype is this: Palantir builds and deploys software that makes institutions more operationally coherent. It integrates data across siloed systems, governs access and permissions, enables analysis at scale, and connects insights directly to workflows where decisions have consequences. In defense, that can mean faster coordination and better targeting. In business, it can mean supply chain optimization or risk control. In public services, it can mean logistics, resource allocation, or system modernization. Why does this matter in the context of the technological republic? Because Palantir is an example of a Silicon Valley company that did not treat national security and state capacity as taboo. It built a business on the premise that software is not just a market product, but a component of institutional power. It forces a confrontation with an uncomfortable reality. The most important problems a society faces, defense, security, resilience, are not solved by consumer apps. They are solved by tools that integrate into institutions and change what those institutions can do. That does not resolve the moral debate, but it clarifies the operational one. And once that operational reality is understood, the book's central question becomes unavoidable. If software and artificial intelligence are becoming decisive in state power, who will build those systems, under what values, and with what level of accountability? At some point, every serious discussion about technology and power collapses into the same uncomfortable question. Not whether a system can be abused, not whether mistakes are possible, but whether the fear of misuse becomes an excuse to do nothing at all. This is the line Karp and Zamiska keep pushing the reader toward, even when it makes people uneasy. The book is not dismissive of civil liberties. It does not wave away the danger of state overreach. What it challenges is something subtler and, in the author's view, more corrosive: the habit of refusing responsibility for hard problems by invoking moral panic in advance. The argument only really comes into focus when it moves out of abstraction and into a specific case. That case is law enforcement. The authors are explicit that attempts to deploy software alongside police departments in American cities provoke a different reaction than similar deployments abroad or in military contexts. The skepticism is deeper, the distrust is visceral, and the burden of justification is dramatically higher. They describe this tension most clearly in their discussion of New Orleans. I'm going to read a passage directly from the book. This is a quotation. Attempts to deploy software alongside law enforcement agencies in American cities have continued to be met with significant skepticism and distrust. In 2012, Palantir began working with the New Orleans Police Department to provide officers with access to the same software platform that had been used by U.S. Special Forces and intelligence analysts in Afghanistan to predict the placement of roadside bombs and capture those making them. The challenge for police officers in New Orleans and across the country was similar to what the U.S. Army had faced in attempting to disrupt the proliferation of bombs that were killing soldiers. Too much information, and a complete lack of the underlying software architecture that would allow such information to be integrated and analyzed in any meaningful way. Criminal investigators and police officers in New Orleans needed a better system for stitching together the patchwork of information they had about criminal networks and tackling gun violence. The use of our platform, known as Gotham, spread quickly across the police department, with the Times-Picayune describing the system as a one-stop shop for pulling up and cross-referencing information and discovering unseen connections among victims, suspects, or witnesses. The critics, however, were swift and fierce. The reaction, indeed, was visceral for many. Why should New Orleans permit the deployment of a software system designed for use in a foreign war on the streets of the city at home? In an essay published in 2018, a policy analyst with the American Civil Liberties Union wrote that the use of data in the context of law enforcement was deeply problematic, given the threats to the civil rights and liberties of individuals who might be unfairly and unconstitutionally targeted by law enforcement as a result of the use of analytical software by the police. The moral outrage and indignation were directed against the application of a novel technology instead of the failure of the city's government to guard its residents. The country spent $25 billion to protect soldiers in Afghanistan from the threat of roadside bombs, but when it came to preventing the loss of American lives in our nation's cities at the hands of the depraved, the mentally ill, and often extraordinarily well-resourced and ruthless violent gangs, the collective reaction is more often one of apathy and resignation. Other technology firms have attempted and abandoned similar projects involving the use of software and artificial intelligence in the context of local law enforcement. In June 2020, Amazon decided to prohibit the use of its widely available and popular facial recognition software by police departments after the company faced criticism that its system might be used to wrongfully target the innocent. That same month, IBM went even further, announcing that it would abandon all research and development into facial recognition capabilities. The company's chief executive officer sent a letter to Senators Cory Booker and Kamala Harris, among others, expressing his company's opposition to the use of the technology for mass surveillance, racial profiling, and violations of basic human rights and freedoms. The letter was representative of an ascendant form of hollow and meaningless corporate pronouncement, condemning an evil for which nobody is advocating. The subtle, interesting, and difficult discussion was not whether the abuse of such systems was justified, but rather whether their proper use had any role to play in stemming violence in our cities. Thousands of people are murdered every year in this country. Hundreds of thousands and arguably millions more live in the shadow of such violence. That passage is doing several things at once, and it's worth slowing down to understand why it matters. First, the authors are not minimizing the risk of abuse. They explicitly acknowledge the civil liberties concerns raised by critics. They do not claim that analytical systems cannot be misused or that mistakes are impossible. In fact, elsewhere in the book, they are explicit that criminal justice is the domain in which error tolerance should be lowest. They cite Voltaire, they cite Blackstone, they cite the long tradition in liberal thought that holds it is better to let the guilty go free than to punish the innocent. They do not argue against that tradition. What they argue against is the idea that the mere possibility of misuse absolves institutions of the obligation to try to govern violence more effectively. This is the core move, and it is the one most people instinctively resist. The authors are saying that the moral Outrage directed at technology is often misdirected. It is easier to condemn a tool than to confront institutional failure. It is easier to block a deployment than to accept responsibility for outcomes. It is easier to say, this is dangerous, than to say, we are failing. The New Orleans case is instructive because it makes the trade-off concrete. The police department was not lacking data, it was drowning in it. Arrest records, incident reports, witness statements, tips, informant notes, call logs. The problem was not surveillance, it was fragmentation. Information existed, but it could not be meaningfully integrated. Patterns were visible only in hindsight. Connections emerged only after people were dead. Gotham, as described, did not invent new categories of data. It did not authorize new forms of collection. It provided a way to stitch together what already existed, so investigators could see networks rather than isolated events. That distinction matters because much of the public reaction ignored it. The outrage was framed as a response to militarization, a war tool being used at home. But the functional problem being addressed was not warfighting. It was coordination. It was sense-making. It was the basic institutional task of turning information into action before harm occurred. The author's most uncomfortable point is this: the same society that spent tens of billions of dollars to protect soldiers abroad accepted routine, normalized violence at home as an unfortunate but immutable fact. That contrast is not rhetorical. It is numerical. It is budgetary. It is reflected in political will. The outrage was intense, the responsibility was diffuse, and that pattern repeats. Amazon and IBM did not withdraw from facial recognition research because a superior moral framework had been discovered. They withdrew because the reputational risk outweighed the institutional commitment. The letters they issued condemned abuses that nobody was defending, while avoiding the harder question of whether constrained, governed use could reduce real harm. This is what the authors mean when they talk about hollow pronouncements. It is moral language used as a shield against responsibility. The key sentence in that passage is not about Palantir at all. It is this one. The subtle, interesting, and difficult discussion was not whether the abuse of such systems was justified, but rather whether their proper use had any role to play in stemming violence in our cities. That is the discussion most institutions refuse to have, because having it requires accepting two uncomfortable truths at once. First, that violence is not abstract. It is patterned. It is social. It concentrates in predictable networks and geographies. It is not random, and therefore it is not ungovernable. Second, that governing it requires tools, trade-offs, and accountability. It requires accepting that action carries risk, and that inaction carries risk too. The authors are arguing that modern institutions have become asymmetrically sensitive to one kind of risk and blind to another. They are exquisitely sensitive to reputational damage, legal exposure, and the risk of public condemnation. They are far less sensitive to diffuse ongoing harm that does not attach itself to a single decision maker. This is where the earlier discussion of conformity, Emerson, and Tetlock comes back into view. Organizations conform not because they lack intelligence, but because they fear disapproval. They fear being wrong in public. They fear revising decisions. They fear being associated with failure, even when failure is the cost of engagement. Tetlock's work matters here because it shows how badly humans perform when they mistake coherence for correctness. When institutions cling to a single moral frame and refuse to adapt to evidence, they perform no better than chance. Foxes outperform hedgehogs not because they are more ethical, but because they are more flexible. The authors are asking the reader to apply that lesson to public safety and technology, not to abandon principles, but to abandon rigidity. The refusal to deploy software in law enforcement is often justified as moral restraint. But restraint without replacement is abdication. If the existing system is failing, if clearance rates are low, if violence is persistent, if communities are trapped in cycles of harm, then refusing to experiment is not neutral. It is a choice with consequences. The book is explicit that criminal justice is not the place for casual pragmatism. Errors matter more here than almost anywhere else. But that does not mean error must be eliminated before action is permitted. It means systems must be designed with asymmetry in mind, higher standards, tighter controls, clearer accountability. What the authors reject is the idea that the only morally acceptable position is to do nothing until perfection is guaranteed. That position, they argue, is not moral. It is evasive. This is where the technology industry comes back into the frame. For years, Silicon Valley gravitated toward consumer products, not only because they were lucrative, but because they were safe. Food delivery does not put you on the front page. Social media moderation debates are exhausting, but they are not existential. Consumer software does not require you to take responsibility for violence, coercion, or life and death trade-offs. Public problems do. The drift toward consumer convenience was not accidental. It was a rational response to a culture that punishes engagement with hard problems more severely than it punishes avoidance. The authors are saying that this drift has costs. When the most capable engineers refuse to work on public safety, those problems do not disappear. They are handled by weaker tools, older systems, or not handled at all. And the people who pay the price are not the ones writing open letters or op-eds. They are the ones living with the consequences. This is why the Palantir case is so central to the book. Not because Palantir is uniquely virtuous, but because it refused to step away. It accepted reputational risk. It accepted public hostility. It accepted the burden of trying to build something in a domain where failure is visible and forgiveness is scarce. That does not make every deployment correct. It does not absolve mistakes, but it does mark a difference in posture. The authors are asking a hard question. If we believe in liberal values, what does it mean to defend them in practice? Not rhetorically, but operationally. It cannot mean paralysis. It cannot mean moral outsourcing. And it cannot mean pretending that complex systems can be governed by slogans. The final lines of the passage are blunt for a reason. Thousands of people are murdered every year. Hundreds of thousands live under the shadow of that violence. That is not an abstraction. It is a policy outcome. The book is not arguing that software is the solution. It is arguing that refusing to use the best available tools is a decision with moral weight. That is the pivot point. From here, the argument turns back to the broader national question. If institutions cannot navigate uncertainty in policing, they will not navigate it in defense. If they cannot tolerate probabilistic thinking in criminal justice, they will not tolerate it in AI governance. If they cannot accept responsibility for outcomes at home, they will not accept it abroad. The problem is not that technology is too powerful. The problem is that belief in responsible action has eroded. And rebuilding that belief, the authors argue, is not about slogans or manifestos. It is about doing the work, accepting scrutiny, and refusing to confuse moral purity with moral seriousness. That is the standard they are setting. And it is the standard the rest of the book insists on holding. If the previous section forces a reckoning with responsibility, this one forces a reckoning with capacity. Karp and Zamiska are explicit that belief by itself does not produce outcomes, nor does morality detached from execution. What matters is whether institutions are capable of acting coherently in environments defined by uncertainty, speed, and consequence. They put the problem plainly early in the book, writing that the market is a powerful engine of destruction, creative and otherwise, but it often fails to deliver what is most needed at the right time. That failure, they argue, is not theoretical. It shows up precisely where coordination, timing, and collective action matter most. This is where the book turns away from cultural critique and toward institutional design. Karp and Zamiska argue that the West's advantage has never rested on innovation alone. It rested on the ability to align talent, capital, and authority around shared projects. That alignment produced the industrial and scientific capacity of the 20th century and the early digital infrastructure of the internet itself. What has changed is not the difficulty of the problems. It is the willingness to engage them. They write that a defining feature of modern elite culture is an unwillingness to risk the disapproval of the crowd, a posture that they describe as lethal to startups and institutions alike. This aversion to disapproval does not just shape individual behavior, it shapes entire organizations. Modern institutions, in their telling, are optimized to avoid blame rather than achieve results. Decision-making authority is fragmented, accountability is diffused, risk is managed reputationally rather than operationally. The safest move is often to delay, defer, or abstain. This is the structural backdrop for what Karp and Zamiska describe as the abandonment of belief. Belief, as they use the term, is not ideological certainty or nationalism. It is the conviction that action is possible, that institutions can learn, and that responsibility cannot be permanently deferred. They warn that when belief collapses, institutions do not stop functioning outright. Instead, they remain content to monetize our search histories, even as they decline to defend our collective security. The machinery keeps running, but it no longer points toward anything consequential. This erosion of belief collides directly with technological reality. Karp and Zamiska argue that software and artificial intelligence compress time. They accelerate feedback loops, they force decisions earlier, and expose institutional weakness faster. In such an environment, evasion becomes visible. They note that the rise of artificial intelligence has only heightened the urgency of revisiting questions of national identity and purpose that many had thought could be safely cast aside. The old luxury of delay is disappearing. This is why they insist that rebuilding is not primarily a moral project, it is an operational one. They are careful to define what rebuilding does not mean. It does not mean blind militarization. It does not mean suspending civil liberties. It does not mean uncritical deployment of technology. Instead, it means accepting that uncertainty cannot be eliminated in advance, only managed responsibly. This is where Karp and Zamiska return to nonconformity and revision. Quoting Emerson, they remind the reader that for nonconformity, the world whips you with its displeasure. They extend this insight to modern life, arguing that the permanence of online statements and the crowd's hostility toward revision have trapped individuals and institutions alike in what they call a straitjacket of our former selves. They are explicit about the cost of this dynamic. They write that nothing of consequence is built in a straight line, and that progress requires a voracious pragmatism, a willingness to bend one's model of the world to the evidence at hand, not bend the evidence. This insistence on adaptability is not abstract. It carries directly into how institutions should be designed. Authority, they argue, must follow information. They describe modern organizations as suffering from a mismatch between where information is generated and where decisions are made. Censors, operators, and local actors see reality first, but authority often sits elsewhere. The result is delay, distortion, and missed opportunity. This problem shows up most starkly in domains where stakes are high and time is short. Law enforcement is one of them. Karp and Zamiska confront this directly in their discussion of policing, and I'm going to quote them again here. Attempts to deploy software alongside law enforcement agencies in American cities have continued to be met with significant skepticism and distrust. Full passage continues as previously read. That passage matters because it exposes a moral asymmetry that rarely gets examined. Karp and Zamiska do not deny the risk of misuse. They do not trivialize civil liberties. Elsewhere in the same chapter, they emphasize that the administration of criminal justice is not the place for pragmatism, for some permissible degree of tolerance for error. They invoke Voltaire and Blackstone to underline the asymmetry of harm in wrongful punishment, but they refuse to accept the conclusion that the only ethical response is abstention. They argue that outrage is often directed at the presence of a new tool rather than at the persistent failure of institutions to protect the public. They write that the moral outrage and indignation were directed against the application of a novel technology instead of the failure of the city's government to guard its residents. This is the pivot. The question, as they frame it, is not whether abuse is acceptable. Nobody argues that it is. The question is whether proper use, constrained, governed, accountable use, has any role to play in reducing real harm. They make the stakes explicit. Thousands of people are murdered every year in this country. Hundreds of thousands and arguably millions more live in the shadow of such violence. Karp and Zamiska contrast this reality with the behavior of technology firms that withdrew from similar work. They describe Amazon's and IBM's retreats from facial recognition and characterize the accompanying statements as hollow and meaningless corporate pronouncements condemning an evil for which nobody is advocating. The condemnation costs nothing, the responsibility is avoided. This is where their broader critique of the technology industry sharpens. For years, Silicon Valley drifted toward consumer problems not because they were more important, but because they were safer. Karp and Zamiska describe this as a form of technological escapism. an instinct to avoid domains that talk back, hold press conferences, or fund pressure groups. The tragedy, they argue, is that this avoidance became normalized. It became a moral posture rather than a business decision. The book insists that this posture is no longer sustainable. Advanced technology now shapes the balance of power between states, between institutions, and within societies themselves. Refusing to engage does not freeze progress. It simply hands initiative to others. This leads to the book's hardest claim. Karp and Zamiska argue that liberal societies cannot preserve their values by refusing responsibility. Rights do not defend themselves. Institutions do not maintain legitimacy by issuing statements. Capacity matters. They are blunt about the geopolitical implication. Others are willing to deploy imperfect systems, iterate in public, and absorb criticism in order to learn faster. That willingness does not make them morally superior, but it does make them effective. In a world where speed, coordination, and decision quality increasingly determine outcomes, effectiveness becomes a form of power. This is why Karp and Zamiska insist that rebuilding belief is not optional. Belief, in their sense, means believing that institutions can still act, that responsibility cannot be permanently outsourced, and that the burden of governing complexity belongs to those capable of doing it. They leave the reader with a question that is not rhetorical. If we are unwilling to do that work, unwilling to accept scrutiny, error, and responsibility, who will do it instead? And if others do it under values we do not share, what exactly will we have preserved by standing aside? That is not a warning. It is a description of the choice as they see it. At the end of the book, Karp and Zamiska do not offer a roadmap, a checklist, or a policy memo. They do something more demanding. They ask who exactly is willing to take responsibility for the world that is now being built. Throughout the book, they return to a simple observation. The most capable technical systems in modern society are no longer marginal. They sit at the center of how power is exercised. They shape military outcomes, economic resilience, public safety, and the credibility of institutions themselves. And yet, the people best positioned to build and govern those systems have spent years convincing themselves that neutrality is possible. Karp and Zamiska reject that premise outright. They argue that the posture of standing outside politics, outside national purpose, and outside institutional responsibility was always a fiction. They write that many technology founders came to see the United States as a dying empire, whose slow descent could not be allowed to stand in the way of their own rise and the new era's gold rush. The result was not just disengagement, but a quiet abdication of obligation. They describe this as a narrowing of moral ambition, a retreat from difficult questions into solvable inconveniences, a worldview in which efficiency replaced judgment and scale replaced purpose. They put it bluntly, the prevailing ethical framework of the Valley has devolved into a narrow and thin utilitarian approach, one that casts individuals as mere atoms in a system to be managed and contained. That framework, they argue, cannot sustain a civilization. What replaces it is not ideology, it is belief. Belief in this book does not mean faith in outcomes or confidence in inevitability. It means belief that collective action is possible, that institutions can still be shaped, and that responsibility cannot be outsourced indefinitely. Karp and Zamiska are clear that belief erodes when people convince themselves that nothing meaningful can be done without causing harm, when fear of misuse becomes a veto on action, when moral cleanliness is purchased at the price of indifference to outcomes. They warn that this erosion has consequences, not abstract ones, strategic ones. They write that the engineering elite of Silicon Valley has an affirmative obligation to participate in the defense of the nation and the articulation of a national project. What is this country? What are our values? And for what do we stand? Not because the state is infallible, but because the alternative is drift. The rise of artificial intelligence sharpens this argument rather than softening it. Karp and Zamiska argue that AI is not just another productivity tool. It is a capability that compresses decision time, magnifies institutional strengths, and exposes institutional weakness. Systems that can sense, decide, and act faster gain real advantages. Systems that cannot fall behind quickly. They write that the rise of artificial intelligence, for the first time in history, presents a plausible challenge to our species for creative supremacy in the world. Whether or not one accepts that framing in full, the implication is clear. The stakes are no longer limited to consumer markets or quarterly returns. In that environment, neutrality becomes indistinguishable from surrender. This is why the book keeps returning to responsibility. Responsibility does not mean blind deployment. It does not mean dismissing civil liberties. Karp and Zamiska explicitly reject that. They emphasize that the possibility of even a single abuse of the software that we are building must guide its construction and deployment. Safeguards matter. Asymmetries of harm matter. But responsibility also means refusing to treat inaction as morally neutral. They write that the subtle, interesting, and difficult discussion is not whether technology can be abused, but whether its proper use has any role to play in addressing real harm. When that discussion is avoided, fear replaces judgment. The book's final demand is aimed squarely at builders. Karp and Zamiska are not writing primarily for policymakers or critics. They are writing for engineers, founders, executives, and institutions that still have leverage over how systems are designed and deployed, and they reject the idea that building toys while others shoulder the burden of defense, infrastructure, and public safety is a morally coherent position. They argue that a civilization that cannot mobilize its most capable people for its hardest problems is not post-national or enlightened. It is fragile. They return to a theme that has run quietly through the entire book, that rights, values, and freedoms are not self-executing. They depend on institutions that function under pressure. They write that it is, of course, the protection of individual rights against state encroachment that took its modern shape within the West, without which the dizzying ascent of Silicon Valley would never have been possible. That inheritance, they argue, carries obligations. In the final pages, the tone is not triumphant. It is sober. Karp and Zamiska do not promise that rebuilding belief will be easy. They do not promise consensus. They do not promise safety from criticism. In fact, they imply the opposite. They return to Emerson one last time, reminding the reader that nonconformity carries cost, and that progress requires a willingness to be disliked, misunderstood, and revised in public. What they insist on is clarity. Either the people who understand how to build powerful systems accept responsibility for how those systems shape the world, or others will do it in their place, and those others may not share the same constraints, values, or hesitation. The book closes on urgency. They write that the moment to decide who we are and what we aspire to be as a society and a civilization is now. Not because catastrophe is guaranteed, but because drift is. That is the choice the book leaves the reader with. Not optimism or despair, not certainty or prophecy, but responsibility to build, to govern what is built, to accept scrutiny, to revise when wrong, and to refuse the comfort of standing aside while claiming virtue. That, Karp and Zamiska argue, is what belief looks like in practice. And whether it returns or continues to erode will shape what comes next.
So then I think the big issue for the U.S. is how do you make sure more people participate in the GDP growth? That what worries me in the U.S. is the winners win more. The non-winners also do much better, but it's societally very difficult when any group does better, even if everyone else does much better. So we are going to have to think a lot about how do you get AI to work. You can use AI to train and skill workers. But that is really important for this country because we do not want to be in a country where we're doing much, much better than every other country, but the average American doesn't see the benefits. And so that's got to be a central focus of what people who are building things think about.